The others were moving into the room now, encircling the table, their faces grim as they looked at us. "But where do these vampires come from?" I whispered. "You've searched your cemetery. If it's vampires, where do they hide from you? This woman can't do you harm. Hunt your vampires if you must." "By day," she said gravely, winking her eye and slowly nodding her head, "by day we get them, by day." "Where?" "Out there in the graveyard, digging up the graves of your own villagers." She shook her head. "The ruins?" she said. "It was always the ruins. We were wrong. In my grandfather's time it was the ruins, and it is the ruins again. We'll take them down stone by stone if we have to. But you go now, because if you don't go, we'll drive you out there into that dark now." And then out from behind her apron she drew her clenched fist with the stake in it and held it up in the flickering light of the candle. "You hear me? You go," she said, and the men pressed in close behind her, their mouths set, their eyes blazing in the light. "Yes," I said to her, "out there. I would prefer that, out there." And I swept past her, almost throwing her aside, seeing them scuttle back to make way. I had my hand on the latch of the inn door and slid it back with one quick gesture. "No," cried the woman in her guttural German, "you're mad." And she rushed up to me and then stared at the latch dumbfounded. She threw her hands up against the rough boards of the door. "Do you know what you do?" "Where are the ruins?" I asked her calmly. "How far? Do they lie to the left of the road or to the right?" "No, no," she shook her head violently. I pried the door back and felt the cold blast of air on my face. One of the women said something sharp and angry from the wall, and one of the children moaned in its sleep. "I'm going. I want one thing from you. Tell me where the ruins lie, so I may stay clear of them. Tell me." You don't know," she said, and then I laid my hand on her warm wrist and drew her slowly through the door. Her feet scraping on the boards, her eyes wild. The men moved nearer, but, as she stepped out against her will into the night, they stopped. She tossed her head, her hair falling down into her eyes glaring at my hand and at my face. "Tell me," I said. I could see she was staring not at me but at Claudia. Claudia had turned towards her, and the light from the fire was on her face. The woman did not see the rounded cheeks, nor the pursed lips, I knew, but Claudia's eyes, which were gazing at her with a dark, demonic intelligence. The woman's teeth bit down into the flesh of her lip. "To the north or south?" "To the north," she whispered. "To the left or the right?" "The left." "And how far?" Her hand struggled desperately. 3 miles, she gasped, and I released her so that she fell back against the door, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. I had turned to go, but suddenly behind me, she cried out for me to wait. I turned to see she'd ripped the crucifix from the beam over her head, and she had it thrust out towards me now. And out of the dark nightmare landscape of my memory, I saw Babette gazing at me as she had so many years ago, saying those words, "Get thee behind me, Satan." But the woman's face was desperate. "Take it, please, in the name of God," she said, "and ride fast." And the door shut, leaving Claudia and me in total darkness. In minutes, the tunnel of the night closed upon the weak lanterns of our carriage, as if the village had never existed. We lurched forward around a bend, the springs creaking, the dim moon revealing for an instant the pale outline of the mountains beyond the pines. I could not stop thinking of Morgan, stop hearing his voice. It was all tangled with my own horrified anticipation of meeting the thing which had killed Emily, the thing which was unquestionably one of our own. But Claudia was in a frenzy. If she could have driven the horses herself, she would have taken the reins. Again and again she urged me to use the whip. She struck savagely at the few low branches that dipped suddenly into the lamps before our faces, and the arm that clung to my waist on the rocking bench was as firm as iron. I remember the road turning sharply, the lanterns clattering, and Claudia calling out over the wind, "There, Louis, do you see it?" And I jerked hard on the reins. She was on her knees pressed against me, and the carnage was swaying like a ship at sea. A great fleecy cloud had released the moon, and high above us loomed the dark outline of the tower. One long window showed the pale sky beyond it. I sat there, clutching the bench, trying to steady emotion that continued in my head as the carriage settled on its springs. One of the horses whinnied, then everything was still. Claudia was saying, "Louis, come." I whispered something, a swift irrational negation. I had the distinct and terrifying impression that Morgan was near to me, talking to me in that low, impassioned way he'd pleaded with me in the inn. Not a living creature stirred in the night around us. There was only the wind and the soft rustling of the leaves. "Do you think he knows we're coming?" I asked, my voice unfamiliar to me over this wind. I was in that little parlor, as if there were no escape from it, as if this dense forest were not real. I think I shuddered, and then I felt Claudia's hand very gently touch the hand I lifted to my eyes. The thin pines were billowing behind her, and the rustle of the leaves grew louder, as if a great mouth sucked the breeze and began a whirlwind. "They'll bury her at the crossroads. Is that what they'll do? An Englishwoman," I whispered. "With that I had your size," Claudia was saying, "and with that you had my heart. Oh, Louis." And her head inclined to me now, so like the attitude of the vampire bending to kiss that I shrank back from her. But her lips only gently pressed on my own, finding a part there to suck the breath and let it flow back into me as my arms enclosed her. "Let me lead you," she pleaded. "There's no turning back now. Take me in your arms," she said, "and let me down on the road." But it seemed an eternity that I just sat there feeling her lips on my face and on my eyelids. Then she moved. The softness of her small body suddenly snatched from me, in a movement so graceful and swift that she seemed now poised in the air beside the carriage, her hand clutching mine for an instant, then letting it go. And then I looked down to see her looking up at me, standing on the road in the shuddering pool of light beneath the lantern. She beckoned to me as she stepped backwards, one small boot behind the other. "Louis, come down," until she threatened to vanish into the darkness. And in a second I'd unfastened the lamp from its hook, and I stood beside her in the tall grass. "Don't you sense the danger?" I whispered to her. "Can't you breathe it like the air?" One of those quick, elusive smiles played on her lips as she turned towards the slope. The lantern pitched a pathway through the rising forest. One small white hand drew the wool of her cape close, and she moved forward. "Wait, only for a moment." "Fear's your enemy," she answered. But she did not stop. She proceeded ahead of the light, feet sure, even as the tall grass gave way gradually to low heaps of rubble, and the forest thickened, and the distant tower vanished, with the fading of the moon and the great weaving of the branches overhead. Soon the sound and scent of the horses died on the low wind. "Be en garde," Claudia whispered, as she moved relentlessly, pausing only now and again where the tangled vines and rock made it seem for moments there was a shelter. But the ruins were ancient. Whether plague or fire or a foreign enemy had ravaged the town, we couldn't know. Only the monastery truly remained. Now, something whispered in the dark that was like the wind and the leaves, but it was neither. I saw Claudia's back straighten, saw the flash of her white palm as she slowed her step. Then I knew it was the water, winding its way slowly down the mountain, and I saw it far ahead through the black trunks, a straight moonlit waterfall descending to a boiling pool below. Claudia emerged silhouetted against the fall, her hand clutching a bare root in the moist earth beside it, and now I saw her climbing hand over hand up the overgrown cliff, her arm trembling ever so slightly, her small boots dangling, then digging in to hold, then swinging free again. The water was cold, and it made the air fragrant and light all around it, so that for a moment I rested. Nothing stirred around me in the forest. I listened, senses quietly separating the tune of the leaves, but nothing else stirred. And then it struck me gradually, like a chill coming over my arms and my throat and finally my face, that the night was too desolate, too lifeless. It was as if even the birds had shunned this place, as well as all the myriad creatures that should have been moving about the banks of this stream. But Claudia, above me on the ledge, was reaching for the lantern, her cape brushing my face. I lifted it so that suddenly she sprang into light like an eerie cherub. She put her hand out for me as if, despite her small size, she could help me up the embankment. In a moment we were moving on again, over the stream, up the mountain. "Do you sense it?" I whispered. "It's too still." But her hand tightened on mine as if to say, "Quiet." The hill was growing steeper and the quiet was unnerving. I tried to stare at the limits of the light, to see each new bark as it loomed before us. Something did move, and I reached for Claudia, almost pulling her sharply near to me. But it was only a reptile, shooting through the leaves with a whip of his tail. The leaves settled, but Claudia moved back against me, under the folds of my cape, a hand firmly clasping the cloth of my coat, and she seemed to propel me forward, my cape falling over the loose fabric of her own. Soon the scent of the water was gone, and when the moon shone clear for an instant, I could see right ahead of us what appeared to be a break in the woods. Claudia firmly clasped the lantern and shut its metal door. I moved to stop this, my hand struggling with hers. But then she said to me quietly, "Close your eyes for an instant and then open them slowly. And when you do, you will see it." A chill rose over me as I did this, during which I held fast to her shoulder. But then I opened my eyes and saw beyond the distant bark of the trees the long, low walls of the monastery and the high square top of the massive tower. Far beyond it, above an immense black valley, gleamed the snow-capped peaks of the mountains. "Come," she said to me, quiet, as if your body has no weight. And she started without hesitation right towards those walls, right towards whatever might have been waiting in their shelter. In moments we had found the gap that would admit us, the great opening that was blacker still than the walls around it, the vines encrusting its edges as if to hold the stones in place. High above, through the open room, the damp smell of the stones strong in my nostrils, I saw beyond the streaks of clouds a faint sprinkling of stars. A great staircase moved upward from corner to corner all the way to the narrow windows that looked out upon the valley, and beneath the first rise of the stair out of the gloom emerged the vast, dark opening to the monastery's remaining rooms. Claudia was still now, as if she had become the stones. In the damp enclosure not even the soft tendrils of her hair moved. She was listening. And then I was listening with her. There was only the low backdrop of the wind. She moved slowly, deliberately, and with one pointed foot, gradually cleared a space in the moist earth in front of her. I could see a flat stone there, and it sounded hollow as she gently tapped it with her heel. Then I could see the broad size of it, and how it rose at one distant corner. And an image came to mind, dreadful in its sharpness, of that band of men and women from the village surrounding the stone, raising it with a giant lever. Claudia's eyes moved over the staircase, and then fixed on the crumbling doorway beneath it. The moon shone for an instant through a lofty window. Then Claudia moved so suddenly that she stood beside me without having made a sound. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. "Listen." It was so low no mortal could have heard it, and it did not come from the ruins. It came from far off, not the long meandering way that we had come up the slope, but another way, up the spine of the hill, directly from the village. Just a rustling now, a scraping, but it was steady, and then slowly the round tramping of a foot began to distinguish itself. Claudia's hand tightened on mine, and with a gentle pressure, she moved me silently beneath the slope of the stairway. I could see the folds of her dress heave slightly beneath the edge of her cape. The tramp of the feet grew louder, and I began to sense that one step preceded the other very sharply, the second dragging slowly across the earth. It was a limping step, drawing nearer and nearer over the low whistling of the wind. My own heart beat hard against my chest, and I felt the veins in my temples tighten, a tremor passing through my limbs, so that I could feel the fabric of my shirt against me, the stiff cut of the collar, the very scraping of the buttons against my cape. Then a faint scent came with the wind. It was the scent of blood, at once arousing me, against my will, the warm, sweet scent of human blood, blood that was spilling, flowing, and then I sensed the smell of living flesh, and I heard in time with the feet a dry, hoarse breathing. But with it came another sound, faint and intermingled with the first, as the feet trampled closer and closer to the walls. The sound of yet another creature's halting, strained breath, and I could hear the heart of that creature beating irregularly, a fearful throbbing, but beneath that was another heart, a steady pulsing heart, growing louder and louder, a heart as strong as my own. Then in the jagged gap through which we'd come I saw him. His great huge shoulder emerged first, and one long loose arm and hand, the fingers curved, then I saw his head. Over his other shoulder he was carrying a body. In the broken doorway he straightened and shifted the weight and stared directly into the darkness towards us. Every muscle in me became iron as I looked at him, saw the outline of his head looming there against the sky. But nothing of his face was visible except the barest glint of the moon on his eye, as if it were a fragment of glass. Then I saw it glint on his buttons and heard them rustle as his arm swung free again, and one long leg bent as he moved forward and proceeded into the tower right towards us. I held fast to Claudia, ready in an instant to shove her behind me, to step forward to meet him. But then I saw with astonishment that his eyes did not see me as I saw him, and he was trudging under the weight of the body he carried towards the monastery door. The moon fell now on his bowed head, on a mass of wavy black hair that touched his bent shoulder, and on the full black sleeve of his coat. I saw something about his coat. The flap of it was badly torn, and the sleeve appeared to be ripped from the seam. I almost fancied I could see his flesh through the shoulder. The human in his arms stirred now and moaned miserably, and the figure stopped for a moment and appeared to stroke the human with his hand. And at that moment I stepped forward from the wall and bent towards him. No words passed my lips. I knew none to say. I only knew that I moved into the light of the moon before him, and that his dark wavy head rose with a jerk, and that I saw his eyes. For one full instant he looked at me, and I saw the light shining in those eyes and then glinting on two sharp canine teeth, and then a low strangled cry seemed to rise from the depths of his throat, which for a second I thought to be my own. The human crashed to the stones, a shuddering moan escaping his lips. And the vampire lunged at me, that strangled cry rising again as the stench of fetid breath rose in my nostrils, and the claw-like fingers cut into the very fur of my cape. I fell backwards, my head cracking against the wall, my hands grabbing at his head, clutching a mass of tangled filth that was his hair. At once the wet, rotting fabric of his coat ripped in my grasp, but the arm that held me was like iron, and as I struggled to pull the head backwards, the fangs touched the flesh of my throat. Claudia screamed behind him. Something hit his head hard, which stopped him suddenly, and then he was hit again. He turned as if to strike her a blow, and I sent my fist against his face as powerfully as I could. Again a stone struck him as she darted away, and I threw my full weight against him and felt his crippled leg buckling. I remember pounding his head over and over, my fingers all but pulling that filthy hair out by the roots, his fangs projected towards me, his hands scratching, clawing at me. We rolled over and over until I pinned him down again and the moon shone full on his face. And I realized through my frantic sobbing breaths what it was I held in my arms. The two huge eyes bulged from naked sockets, and two small hideous holes made up his nose. Only a putrid leathery flesh enclosed his skull, and the rank rotting rags that covered his frame were thick with earth and slime and blood. I was battling a mindless animated corpse, but no more. From above him a sharp stone fell full on his forehead, and a fount of blood gushed from between his eyes. He struggled, but another stone crashed with such force I heard the bones shatter. Blood seeped out beneath the matted hair, soaking into the stones and grass. The chest throbbed beneath me, but the arms shuddered and grew still. I drew up, my throat knotted, my heart burning, every fiber of my body aching from the struggle. For a moment the great tower seemed to tilt, but then it righted itself. I lay against the wall staring at the thing, the blood rushing in my ears. Gradually I realized that Claudia knelt on his chest, that she was probing the mass of hair and bone that had been his head. She was scattering the fragments of his skull. We had met the European vampire, the creature of the old world. He was dead. For a long time I lay on the broad stairway, oblivious to the thick earth that covered it, my head feeling very cool against the earth, just looking at him. Claudia stood at his feet, hands hanging limply at her sides. I saw her eyes close for an instant, two tiny lids that made her face like a small moonlit white statue as she stood there. And then her body began to rock very slowly. "Claudia," I called to her. She awakened. She was gaunt, such as I had seldom seen her. She pointed to the human who lay far across the floor of the tower near the wall. He was still motionless, but I knew that he was not dead. I'd forgotten him completely, my body aching as it was, my senses still clouded with the stench of the bleeding corpse. But now I saw the man, and in some part of my mind I knew what his fate would be, and I cared nothing for it. I knew it was only an hour at most before dawn. "He's moving," she said to me, and I tried to rise off the steps. Better that he not wake. Better that he never wake at all, I wanted to say. She was walking towards him, passing indifferently, the dead thing that had nearly killed us both. I saw her back and the man staring in front of her, his foot twisting in the grass. I don't know what I expected to see as I drew nearer, what terrified peasant or farmer, what miserable wretch that had already seen the face of that thing that had brought it here. And for a moment I did not realize who it was that lay there, that it was Morgan, whose pale face showed now in the moon the marks of the vampire on his throat, his blue eyes staring mute and expressionless before him. Suddenly they widened as I drew close to him. "Louis!" he whispered in astonishment, his lips moving as if he were trying to frame words but could not. "Louis!" he said again, and then I saw he was smiling. A dry rasping sound came from him as he struggled to his knees, and he reached out for me, his blanched, contorted face strained as the sound died in his throat, and he nodded desperately, his red hair loose and disheveled falling into his eyes. I turned and ran from him. Claudia shot past me, gripping me by the arm. "Do you see the color of the sky?" she hissed at me. Morgan fell forward on his hands behind her. "Louis!" he called out again, the light gleaming in his eyes. He seemed blind to the ruins, blind to the night, blind to everything but a face he recognized, that one word again issuing from his lips. I put my hands to my ears, backing away from him. His hand was bloody now as he lifted it. I could smell the blood as well as see it, and Claudia could smell it too. Swiftly she descended on him, pushing him down against the stones, her white fingers moving through his red hair. He tried to raise his head. His outstretched hands made a frame about her face. And then suddenly he began to stroke her yellow curls. She sank her teeth and the hands dropped helpless at his side. I was at the edge of the forest when she caught up with me. "You must go to him, take him," she commanded. I could smell the blood on her lips, see the warmth in her cheeks. Her wrist burned against me, yet I did not move. "Listen to me, Louis," she said, her voice at once desperate and angry. "I left him for you, but he's dying. There's no time." I swung her up into my arms and started the long descent. No need for caution, no need for stealth, no preternatural host waiting. The door to the secrets of Eastern Europe was shut against us. I was plowing through the dark to the road. "Will you listen to me?" she cried out. But I went on in spite of her, her hands clutching at my coat, my hair. "Do you see the sky? Do you see it?" she railed. She was all but sobbing against my breast as I splashed through the icy stream and ran headlong in search of the lantern at the road. The sky was a dark blue when I found the carriage. "Give me the crucifix," I shouted to Claudia as I cracked the whip. "There's only one place to go." She was thrown against me as the carriage rocked into its turn and headed for the village. I had the eeriest feeling then as I could see the mist rising amongst the dark brown trees. The air was cold and fresh and the birds had begun. It was as if the sun were rising. Yet I did not care. And yet I knew that it was not rising, that there was still time. It was a marvelous, quieting feeling. The scrapes and cuts burned my flesh and my heart ached with hunger. But my head felt marvelously light. Until I saw the gray shapes of the inn and the steeple of the church, they were too clear, and the stars above were fading fast. In a moment I was hammering on the door of the inn. As it opened, I put my hood up around my face tightly and held Claudia beneath my cape in a bundle. "Your village is rid of the vampire," I said to the woman, who stared at me in astonishment. I was clutching the crucifix which she'd given me. "Thanks be to God, he's dead. You'll find the remains in the tower. Tell this to your people at once." I pushed past her into the inn. The gathering was roused into commotion instantly, but I insisted that I was tired beyond endurance. I must pray and rest. They were to get my chest from the carriage and bring it to a decent room where I might sleep. But a message was to come for me from the bishop at Varna, and for this and this only was I to be awakened. "Tell the good father when he arrives that the vampire is dead, and then give him food and drink and have him wait for me," I said. The woman was crossing herself. "You understand?" I said to her as I hurried towards the stairs. "I couldn't reveal my mission to you until after the vampire had been—" "Yes, yes," she said to me. "But you are not a priest. The child—" "No, only too well versed in these matters. The unholy one is no match for me," I said to her. I stopped. The door of the little parlor stood open, with nothing but a white square of cloth on the oak table. "Your friend," she said to me, and she looked at the floor. "He rushed out into the night. He was mad." I only nodded. I could hear them shouting when I shut the door of the room. They seemed to be running in all directions. And then came the sharp sound of the church bell and the rapid peal of alarm. Claudia had slipped down from my arms, and she was staring at me gravely as I bolted the door. Very slowly I unlatched the shutter of the window. An icy light seeped into the room. Still she watched me. Then I felt her at my side. I looked down to see she was holding out her hand to me. "Here," she said. She must have seen I was confused. I felt so weak that her face was shimmering as I looked at it, the blue of her eyes dancing on her white cheeks. "Drink," she whispered, drawing nearer. "Drink." And she held the soft, tender flesh of the wrist towards me. "No, I know what to do. Haven't I done it in the past?" I said to her. It was she who bolted the window tight, latched the heavy door. I remember kneeling by the small grate and feeling the ancient paneling. It was rotten behind the varnished surface, and it gave under my fingers. Suddenly I saw my fist go through it and felt the sharp jab of splinter in my wrist. And then I remember feeling in the dark and catching hold of something warm and pulsing. A rush of cold, damp air hit my face, and I saw a darkness rising about me, cool and damp as if this air were a silent water that seeped through the broken wall and filled the room. The room was gone. I was drinking from a never-ending stream of warm blood that flowed down my throat and through my pulsing heart and through my veins, so that my skin warmed against this cool, dark water, and now the pulse of the blood I drank slackened. and all my body cried out for it not to slacken, my heart pounding, trying to make that heart pound with it. I felt myself rising as if I were floating in the darkness, and then the darkness, like the heartbeat, began to fade. Something glimmered in my swoon. It shivered ever so slightly with the pounding of feet on the stairs, on the floorboards, the rolling of wheels and horses' hooves on the earth, and it gave off a tinkling sound as it shivered. It had a small wooden frame around it, and in that frame there emerged through the glimmer the figure of a man. He was familiar. I knew his long, slender build, his black, wavy hair. Then I saw that his green eyes were gazing at me, and in his teeth, he was clutching something huge and soft and brown, which he pressed tightly with both his hands. It was a rat, a great loathsome brown rat he held, its feet poised, its mouth agape, its great curved tail frozen in the air. Crying out, he threw it down and stared aghast, blood flowing from his open mouth. A searing light hit my eyes. I struggled to open them against it, and the entire room was glowing. Claudia was right in front of me. She was not a tiny child, but someone much larger who drew me forward towards her with both hands. She was on her knees, and my arms encircled her waist. Then darkness descended, and I had folded her against me. The lock slid into place, numbness came over my limbs, and then the paralysis of oblivion. And that was how it was throughout Transylvania and Hungary and Bulgaria, and through all those countries where the peasants know that the living dead walk, and the legends of the vampires abound. In every village where we did encounter the vampire, it was the same. A mindless corpse? The boy asked. Always, said the vampire. When we found these creatures at all, I remember a handful at most. Sometimes we only watched them from a distance, all too familiar with their wagging, bovine heads, their haggard shoulders, their rotted, ragged clothing. In one hamlet, it was a woman, only dead for perhaps a few months. The villagers had glimpsed her and knew by her name. It was she who gave us the only hope we were to experience after the monster in Transylvania, and that hope came to nothing. She fled from us through the forest, and we ran after her, reaching out for her long black hair. Her white burial gown was soaked with dried blood, her fingers caked with the dirt of the grave, and her eyes, they were mindless, two pools that reflected the moon, no secrets, no truths, only despair. But what were these creatures? Why were they like this? Asked the boy, his lips grimacing with disgust. I don't understand. How could they be so different from you and Claudia, yet exist? I had my theories, so did Claudia, but the main thing which I had then was despair. And in despair, the recurring fear that we had killed the only other vampires like us, Lestat. Yet it seemed unthinkable. Had he possessed the wisdom of a sorcerer, the powers of a witch, I might have come to understand that he had somehow managed to wrest a conscious life from the same forces that governed these monsters. But he was only Lestat as I've described him to you, devoid of mystery, finally, his limits as familiar to me in those months, in Eastern Europe as his charms. I wanted to forget him. And yet it seemed I thought of him always. It was as if the empty nights were made for thinking of him, and sometimes I found myself so vividly aware of him, it was as if he had only just left the room and the ring of his voice were still there. And somehow there was a disturbing comfort in that, and despite myself, I'd envision his face. Not as it had been the last night in the fire, but on other nights, that last evening he spent with us at home, his hand playing idly with the keys of the spinet, his head tilted to one side. A sickness rose in me more wretched than anguish when I saw what my dreams were doing. I wanted him alive. In the dark nights of Eastern Europe, Lestat was the only vampire I'd found. But Claudia's waking thoughts were of a far more practical nature. Over and over she had me recount that night in the hotel in New Orleans when she'd become a vampire, and over she searched the process for some clue to why these things we met in the country graveyards had no mind. What if after Lestat's infusion of blood she'd been put in a grave, closed up in until the preternatural drive for blood caused her to break the stone door of the vault that held her? What then would her mind have been? Starved, as it were, to the breaking point? Her body might have saved itself when no mind remained, and through the world she would have blundered, ravaging where she could, as we saw these creatures do. That was how she explained them, but what had fathered them? How had they begun? That was what she couldn't explain, and what gave her hope of discovery when I, from sheer exhaustion, had none. They spawn their own kind, it's obvious, but where does it begin, she asked. And then somewhere near the outskirts of Vienna she put the question to me which had never before passed her lips. Why could I not do what Lestat had done with both of us? Why could I not make another vampire? I don't know why at first I didn't even understand her, except that in loathing what I was, with every impulse in me, I had a particular fear of that question, which was almost worse than any other. You see, I didn't understand something strong in myself. Loneliness had caused me to think on that very possibility years before, when I had fallen under the spell of Babette Frenière, but I held it locked inside of me like an unclean passion. I shunned mortal life after her. I killed strangers, and the Englishman Morgan, because I knew him, was as safe from my fatal embrace as Babette had been. They both caused me too much pain. Death I couldn't think of giving them. Life in death, it was monstrous. I turned away from Claudia. I wouldn't answer her. But angry as she was, wretched as was her impatience, she could not stand this turning away, and she drew near to me, comforting me with her hands and her eyes, as if she were my loving daughter. "Don't think on it, Louis," she said later, when we were comfortably situated in a small suburban hotel. I was standing at the window, looking at the distant glow of Vienna, so eager for that city, its civilization, its sheer size. The night was clear and the haze of the city was on the sky. "Let me put your conscience at ease, though I'll never know precisely what it is," she said into my ear, her hand stroking my hair. "Do that, Claudia," I answered her. "Put it at ease. Tell me that you'll never speak to me of making vampires again." "I want no orphans such as ourselves," she said all too quickly. My words annoyed her. My feeling annoyed her. "I want answers. Knowledge," she said. "But tell me, Louis, what makes you so certain that you've never done this without your knowing it?" Again there was that deliberate obtuseness in me. I must look at her as if I didn't know the meaning of her words. I wanted her to be silent and to be near me, and for us to be in Vienna. I drew her hair back and let my fingertips touch her long lashes, and looked away at the light. "After all, what does it take to make those creatures?" she went on. "Those vagabond monsters. How many drops of your blood intermingled with a man's blood, and what kind of heart to survive that first attack?" I could feel her watching my face, and I stood there, my arms folded, my back to the side of the window, looking out. "That pale-faced Emily, that miserable Englishman," she said, oblivious to the flicker of pain in my face. "Their hearts were nothing, and it was the fear of death as much as the drawing of blood that killed them. The idea killed them. But what of the hearts that survive? Are you sure you haven't fathered a league of monsters who, from time to time, struggled vainly and instinctively to follow in your footsteps? What was their lifespan, these orphans you left behind you? A day there, a week here, before the sun burnt them to ashes or some mortal victim cut them down? Stop it, I begged her. If you knew how completely I envision everything you describe, you would not describe it. I tell you it's never happened. Lestat drained me to the point of death to make me a vampire, and gave back all that blood mingled with his own. That is how it was done." She looked away from me, and then it seemed she was looking down at her hands. I think I heard her sigh, but I wasn't certain, and then her eyes moved over me, slowly, up and down, before they finally met mine. Then it seemed she smiled. "Don't be frightened of my fancy," she said softly. "After all, the final decision will always rest with you. Is that not so?" "I don't understand," I said, and a cold laughter erupted from her as she turned away. "Can you picture it?" she said, so softly I scarcely heard. "A coven of children. That is all I could provide." "Claudia," I murmured. "Rest easy," she said abruptly, her voice still low. "I tell you that as much as I hated Lestat—" She stopped. "Yes," I whispered, "yes. As much as I hated him, with him we were complete." She looked at me, her eyelids quivering, as if the slight rise in her voice had disturbed her, even as it had disturbed me. "No, only you were complete," I said to her, "because there were two of us, one on either side of you from the beginning." I thought I saw her smile then, but I was not certain. She bowed her head, but I could see her eyes moving beneath the lashes, back and forth, back and forth. Then she said, "The two of you at my side, do you picture that as you say it, as you picture everything else?" One night, long gone by, was as material to me as if I were in it still, but I didn't tell her. She was desperate in that night, running away from Lestat, who had urged her to kill a woman in the street from whom she'd backed off, clearly alarmed. I was sure the woman had resembled her mother. Finally, she'd escaped us entirely, but I'd found her in the armoire beneath the jackets and coats, clinging to her doll. And carrying her to the crib, I sat beside her and sang to her, and she stared at me as she clung to that doll, as if trying blindly and mysteriously to calm a pain she herself did not begin to understand. Can you picture it? this splendid domesticity, dim lamps, the vampire father singing to the vampire daughter. Only the doll had a human face, only the doll. But we must get away from here, said the present Claudia suddenly, as though the thought had just taken shape in her mind with a special urgency. She had her hand to her ear, as if clutching it against some awful sound. From the roads behind us, from what I see in your eyes now, because I give voice to thoughts which are nothing more to me than plain considerations? Forgive me, I said as gently as I could, withdrawing slowly from that long-ago room, that ruffled crib, that frightened monster child and monster voice. And Lestat? Where was Lestat? A match striking in the other room, a shadow leaping suddenly into life as light and dark come alive where there was only darkness. No, you forgive me, she was saying to me now, in this little hotel room near the first capital of Western Europe. No, we forgive each other, but we don't forgive him. And without him, you see what things are between us. Only now, because we are tired and things are dreary, I said to her and to myself, because there was no one else in the world to whom I could speak. Ah, yes, and that is what must end, I tell you. I begin to understand that we have done it all wrong from the start. We must bypass Vienna. We need our language, our people. I want to go directly now to Paris. I think the very name of Paris brought a rush of pleasure to me that was extraordinary, a relief so near to well-being that I was amazed. Not only that I could feel it, but that I'd so nearly forgotten it. I wonder if you can understand what it meant. My expression can't convey it now, for what Paris means to me is very different from what it meant then in those days at that hour. But still, even now, to think of it, I feel something akin to that happiness. And I've more reason now than ever to say that happiness is not what I will ever know, or will ever deserve to know. I am not so much in love with happiness, yet the name Paris makes me feel it. Mortal beauty often makes me ache, and mortal grandeur can fill me with that longing I felt so hopelessly in the Mediterranean Sea. But Paris drew me close to the heart, so I forgot myself entirely, forgot the damned and questing preternatural thing that doted on mortal skin and mortal clothing. Paris overwhelmed, enlightened, and rewarded more richly than any promise. It was the mother of New Orleans, understand that first. It had given New Orleans its life, its first populace, and it was what New Orleans had for so long tried to be. But New Orleans, though beautiful and desperately alive, was desperately fragile. There was something forever savage and primitive there, something that threatened the exotic and sophisticated life, both from within and without. Not an inch of those wooden streets nor a brick of the crowded Spanish houses had not been bought from the fierce wilderness that forever surrounded the city, ready to engulf it. Hurricanes, floods, fevers, the plague, and the damp of the Louisiana climate itself worked tirelessly on every hewn plank or stone facade, so that New Orleans seemed at all times like a dream in the imagination of her striving populace, a dream held intact at every second by a tenacious though unconscious collective will. But Paris was a universe whole and entire unto herself, hollowed and fashioned by history. So she seemed in this age of Napoleon III, with her towering buildings, her massive cathedrals, her grand boulevards, and ancient winding medieval streets, as vast and indestructible as nature itself. All was embraced by her volatile and enchanted populace, thronging the galleries, the theaters, the cafes, giving birth over and over to genius and sanctity, philosophy and war, frivolity and the finest art. So it seemed that if all the world outside her were to sink into darkness, what was fine, what was beautiful, what was essential might there still come to its finest flower. Even the majestic trees that graced and sheltered her streets were attuned to her, and the waters of the Seine, contained and beautiful as they wound through her heart, so that the earth on that spot, so shaped by blood and consciousness, had ceased to be the earth and had become Paris. We were alive again, we were in love, and so euphoric was I after those hopeless nights of wandering in Eastern Europe that I yielded completely when Claudia moved us into the Hotel Saint Gabriel on the Boulevard des Capucines. It was rumored to be one of the largest hotels in Europe, its immense rooms dwarfing the memory of our old townhouse, while at the same time recalling it with a comfortable splendor, We were to have one of the finest suites. Our windows looked out over the gaslit boulevard itself where, in the early evening, the asphalt sidewalks teemed with strollers, and an endless stream of carriages flowed past, taking lavishly dressed ladies and their gentlemen to the opera, or the opera comique, the ballet, the theaters, the balls and receptions without end at the Tuileries. Claudia put her reasons for expense to me gently and logically, but I could see that she became impatient, ordering everything through me. It was wearing for her. The hotel, she said quietly, afforded us complete freedom, our nocturnal habits going unnoticed in the continual press of European tourists, our rooms immaculately maintained by an anonymous staff, while the immense price we paid guaranteed our privacy and our security. But there was more to it than that. There was a feverish purpose to her buying. "This is my world," she explained to me as she sat in a small velvet chair before the open balcony, watching the long row of broughams stopping one by one before the hotel doors. "I must have it as I like it," she said, as if speaking to herself. And so it was as she liked: stunning wallpaper of rose and gold, an abundance of damask and velvet furniture, embroidered pillows and silk trappings for the four-poster bed, dozens of roses appeared daily for the marble mantels, and the inlaid tables, crowding the curtained alcove of her dressing room, reflected endlessly in tilted mirrors. And finally she crowded the high French windows with a veritable garden of camellia and fern. "I miss the flowers more than anything else. I miss the flowers," she mused, and sought after them even in the paintings which we brought from the shops and the galleries. Magnificent canvases such as I'd never seen in New Orleans, from the classically executed lifelike bouquets, tempting you to reach for the petals that fell on a three-dimensional tablecloth, to a new and disturbing style in which the colors seem to blaze with such intensity they destroy the old lines, the old solidity, to make a vision like to those states when I'm nearest my delirium, and flowers grow before my eyes and crackle like the flames of lamps. Paris flowed into these rooms. I found myself at home there, again forsaking dreams of ethereal simplicity for what another's gentle insistence had given me, because the air was sweet like the air of our courtyard in the Rue Royale. And all was alive with a shocking profusion of gaslight that rendered even the ornate lofty ceilings devoid of shadows. The light raced on the gilt curlicues, flickered in the baubles of the chandeliers. Darkness did not exist. Vampires did not exist. And even bent as I was on my quest, it was sweet to think that for an hour father and daughter climbed into the cabriolet from such civilized luxury, only to ride along the banks of the Seine, over the bridge into the Latin Quarter, to roam those darker, narrower streets in search of history, not victims, and then to return to the ticking clock and the brass andirons and the playing cards laid out upon the table, books of poets, the program from a play, and all around the soft humming of the vast hotel, distant violins, a woman talking in a rapid animated voice above the zinging of a hairbrush, and a man high above on the top floor repeating over and over to the night air, "I understand. I'm just beginning. I'm just beginning to understand." "Is it as you would have it?" Claudia asked, perhaps just to let me know she hadn't forgotten me, for she was quiet now for hours, no talk of vampires. But something was wrong. It was not the old serenity, the pensiveness that was recollection. There was a brooding there, a smoldering dissatisfaction. And though it would vanish from her eyes when I would call to her or answer her, anger seemed to settle very near the surface. "Oh, you know how I would have it," I answered, persisting in the myth of my own will. "Some garret near the Sorbonne, near enough to the noise of the Rue Saint-Michel, far enough away, but I would mainly have it as you would have it." And I could see her warmed but looking past me, as if to say, "You have no remedy, don't draw too near. Don't ask of me what I ask of you. Are you content?" My memory is too clear, too sharp. Things should wear at the edges, and what is unresolved should soften. So scenes are near my heart like pictures and lockets, yet monstrous pictures no artist or camera would ever catch. And over I would see Claudia at the piano's edge that last night, when Lestat was playing, preparing to die, her face when he was taunting her, that contortion that at once became a mask. Attention might have saved his life if, in fact, he were dead at all. Something was collecting in Claudia, revealing itself slowly to the most unwilling witness in the world. She had a new passion for rings and bracelets children did not wear. Her jaunty straight back walk was not a child's, and often she entered small boutiques ahead of me and pointed a commanding finger at the perfume or the gloves she would then pay for herself. I was never far away and always uncomfortable, not because I feared anything in this vast city, but because I feared her. She'd always been the lost child to her victims, the orphan. And now it seemed she would be something else, something wicked and shocking to the passers-by who succumbed to her. But this was often private. I was left for an hour haunting the carved edifices of Notre Dame, or sitting at the edge of a park in the carriage. And then one night when I awoke on the lavish bed in the suite of the hotel, my book crunched uncomfortably under me. I found her gone altogether. I didn't dare ask the attendants if they'd seen her. It was our practice to spirit past them. We had no name. I searched the corridors for her, the side streets, even the ballroom, where some almost inexplicable dread came over me at the thought of her there alone. But then I finally saw her coming through the side doors of the lobby, her hair beneath her bonnet brim sparkling from the light rain, the child rushing as if on a mischievous escapade, lighting the faces of doting men and women as she mounted the grand staircase, and past me, as if she hadn't seen me at all. An impossibility, a strange, graceful sleight. I shut the door behind me just as she was taking off her cape, and in a flurry of golden raindrops she shook her hair. The ribbons crushed from the bonnet fell loose, and I felt a palpable relief to see the childish dress, those ribbons, and something wonderfully comforting in her arms, a small china doll. Still she said nothing to me. She was fussing with the doll, jointed somehow with hooks or wire beneath its flouncing dress. Its tiny feet tinkled like a bell. "It's a lady doll," she said, looking up at me. "See? A lady doll." She put it on the dresser. "So it is," I whispered. "A woman made it," she said. "She makes baby dolls all the same. Baby dolls. A shop of baby dolls," until I said to her, "I want a lady doll." It was taunting, mysterious. She sat there now with the wet strands of hair streaking her high forehead, intent on that doll. "Do you know why she made it for me?" she asked. I was wishing now the room had shadows, that I could retreat from the warm circle of the superfluous fire into some darkness, that I wasn't sitting on the bed as if on a lighted stage, seeing her before me and in her mirrors, puff sleeves and puff sleeves. "Because you are a beautiful child and she wanted to make you happy?" I said, my voice small and foreign to myself. She was laughing soundlessly. "A beautiful child?" she said, glancing up at me. "Is that what you still think I am?" And her face went dark as again she played with the doll, her fingers pushing the tiny crocheted neckline down toward the china breasts. "Yes, I remember her baby dolls. I am her baby dolls. You should see her working in that shop, bent on her dolls, each with the same face, lips." Her finger touched her own lip. Something seemed to shift suddenly, something within the very walls of the room itself, and the mirrors trembled with her image, as if the earth had sighed beneath the foundations. Carriages rumbled in the streets, but they were too far away. Then I saw what her still childish figure was doing. In one hand she held a doll, the other to her lips, and the hand that held the doll was crushing it and popping it so it bobbed and broke in a heap of glass that fell now from her open bloody hand onto the carpet. She wrung the tiny dress to make a shower of glittering particles as I averted my eyes, only to see her in the tilted mirror over the fire, see her eyes scanning me from my feet to the top of my head. She moved through that mirror towards me and drew close on the bed. "Why do you look away? Why don't you look at me?" she asked, her voice very smooth, very like a silver bell. But then she laughed softly, a woman's laugh, and said, "Did you think I'd be your daughter forever? Are you the father of fools, the fool of fathers?" "Your tone is unkind with me," I answered. Unkind? I think," she nodded. She was ablaze in the corner of my eye, blue flames, golden flames. "And what do they think of you?" I asked as gently as I could out there. I gestured to the open window. "Many things," she smiled, "many things. Men are marvelous at explanations. Have you seen the little people in the parks, the circuses, the freaks that men pay money to laugh at?" "I was a sorcerer's apprentice only," I burst out suddenly despite myself. "Apprentice!" I said. I wanted to touch her, to stroke her hair, but I sat there afraid of her anger like a match about to kindle. Again she smiled, and then she drew my hand into her lap and covered it as best she could with her own. "Apprentice? Yes," she laughed. "But tell me one thing from that lofty height. What was it like, making love?" I was walking away from her before I meant to. I was searching like a dim-wilted mortal man for cape and gloves. "You don't remember?" she asked with perfect calm as I put my hand on the brass door handle. I stopped, feeling her eyes on my back, ashamed. Then I turned around and made as if to think, "Where am I going? What shall I do? Why do I stand here?" "It was something hurried," I said, trying now to meet her eyes, how perfectly coldly blue they were, how earnest. "And it was seldom savored, something acute that was quickly lost. I think that it was the pale shadow of killing." "Ah," she said, "like hurting you as I do now, that is also the pale shadow of killing." "Yes, madam," I said to her, "I am inclined to believe that is correct," and bowing swiftly, I bade her good night. It was a long time after I'd left her that I slowed my pace. I'd crossed the Seine. I wanted darkness, to hide from her and the feelings that welled up in me, and the great consuming fear that I was utterly inadequate to make her happy or to make myself happy by pleasing her. I would have given the world to please her, the world we now possessed, which seemed at once empty and eternal. Yet I was injured by her words and by her eyes, and no amount of explanations to her, which passed through and through my mind now, even forming on my lips in desperate whispers as I left the Rue Saint-Michel and went deeper and deeper into the older, darker streets of the Latin Quarter, no amount of explanation seemed to soothe what I imagined to be her grave dissatisfaction, or my own pain. Finally, I left off words except for a strange chant. I was in the black silence of a medieval street, and blindly I followed its sharp turns, comforted by the height of its narrow tenements, which seemed at any moment capable of falling together, closing this alleyway under the indifferent stars like a seam. I cannot make her happy, I do not make her happy, and her unhappiness increases every day. This was my chant, which I repeated like a rosary, a charm to change the facts, her inevitable disillusionment with our quest, which left us in this limbo where I felt her drawing away from me, dwarfing me with her enormous need. I even conceived a savage jealousy of the doll-maker to whom she'd confided her request for that tinkling, diminutive lady, because that doll-maker had for a moment given her something which she held close to herself in my presence, as if I were not there at all. What did it amount to? Where could it lead? Never since I'd come to Paris months before did I so completely feel the city's immense size, how I might pass from this twisting blind street of my choice into a world of delights, and never had I so keenly felt its uselessness. Uselessness to her, if she could not abide this anger, if she could not somehow grasp the limits of which she seemed so angrily, bitterly aware. I was helpless, she was helpless, but she was stronger than I, and I knew, had known even at the moment when I turned away from her in the hotel, that behind her eyes there was for me her continuing love. And dizzy and weary and now comfortably lost, I became aware with the vampire's inextinguishable senses that I was being followed. My first thought was irrational. She'd come out after me, and cleverer than I had tracked me at a great distance. But as surely as this came to mind, another thought presented itself, a rather cruel thought in light of all that had passed between us. The steps were too heavy for hers. It was just some mortal walking in this same alley, walking unwearily towards death. So I continued on, almost ready to fall into my pain again because I deserved it, when my mind said, "You are a fool, listen." And it dawned on me that these steps, echoing as they were at a great distance behind me, were in perfect time with my own. An accident, because if mortal they were too far off for mortal hearing. But as I stopped now to consider that, they stopped. And as I turned saying, "Louis, you deceive yourself," and started up, they started up. Footfall with my footfall, gaining speed now as I gained speed, and then something remarkable, undeniable occurred. En garde! As I was for the steps that were behind me, I tripped on a fallen roof tile and was pitched against the wall, and behind me those steps echoed to perfection the sharp, shuffling rhythm of my fall. I was astonished, and in a state of alarm well beyond fear. To the right and left of me the street was dark. Not even a tarnished light shone in a garret window, and the only safety afforded me the great distance between myself and these steps was, as I said, the guarantee that they were not human. I was at a complete loss as to what I might do, and I had the near irresistible desire to call out to this being and welcome it, to let it know as quickly and as completely as possible that I awaited it, had been searching for it, would confront it. Yet I was afraid. What seemed sensible was to resume walking waiting for it to gain on me, and as I did so, I was again mocked by my own pace. And the distance between us remained the same. The tension mounted in me, the dark around me becoming more and more menacing. And I said over and over, measuring these steps, "Why do you track me? Why do you let me know you are there?" Then I rounded a sharp turn in the street, and a gleam of light showed ahead of me at the next corner. The street sloped up towards it, and I moved on very slowly, my heart deafening in my ears, reluctant to eventually reveal myself in that light. And as I hesitated, stopped, in fact, right before the turn, something rumbled and clattered above, as if the roof of the house beside me had all but collapsed. I jumped back just in time before a load of tiles crashed into the street, one of them brushing my shoulder. All was quiet now. I stared at the tiles, listening, waiting. And then slowly I edged around the turn into the light, only to see there looming over me at the top of the street beneath the gas lamp the unmistakable figure of another vampire. He was enormous in height, though gaunt as myself, his long white face very bright under the lamp, his large black eyes staring at me in what seemed undisguised wonder. His right leg was slightly bent, as though he'd just come to a halt in mid-step. And then suddenly I realized that not only was his black hair long and full and combed precisely like my own, and not only was he dressed in identical coat and cape to my own, but he stood imitating my stance and facial expression to perfection. I swallowed and let my eyes pass over him slowly while I struggled to hide from him the rapid pace of my pulse, as his eyes in like manner passed over me. And when I saw him blink, I realized I had just blinked, and as I drew my arms up and folded them across my chest, he slowly did the same. It was maddening, worse than maddening, because as I barely moved my lips, he barely moved his lips. And I found the words dead, and I couldn't make other words to confront this, to stop it. And all the while there was that height and those sharp black eyes and that powerful attention, which was of course perfect mockery. But nevertheless, riveted to myself, he was the vampire, I seemed the mirror. "Clever," I said to him shortly and desperately, and of course he echoed that word as fast as I said it. And maddened as I was, more by that than anything else, I found myself yielding to a slow smile, defying the sweat which had broken from every pore, and the violent tremor in my legs. He also smiled, but his eyes had a ferocity that was animal, unlike my own, and the smile was sinister in its sheer mechanical quality. Now I took a step forward, and so did he, and when I stopped short staring, so did he. But then very slowly, lifted his right arm, though mine remained poised, and gathering his fingers into a fist, he now struck at his chest in quickening time to mock my heartbeat. Laughter erupted from him. He threw back his head, showing his canine teeth, and the laughter seemed to fill the alleyway. I loathed him completely. "You mean me harm?" I asked, only to hear the words mockingly obliterated. "Trickster," I said sharply. "Buffoon." That word stopped him, died on his lips even as he was saying it, and his face went hard. What I did then was impulse. I turned my back on him and started away, perhaps to make him come after me and demand to know who I was. But in a movement so swift I couldn't possibly have seen it, he stood before me again, as if he had materialized there. Again I turned my back on him, only to face him under the lamp again, the settling of his dark wavy hair, the only indication that he had in fact moved. "I've been looking for you. I've come to Paris looking for you." I forced myself to say the words, seeing that he didn't echo them or move, only stood staring at me. Now he moved forward slowly, gracefully, and I saw his own body and his own manner had regained possession of him, and extending his hand as if he meant to ask for mine, he very suddenly pushed me backwards, off balance. I could feel my shirt drenched and sticking to my flesh. As I righted myself, my hand grimed from the damp wall, and as I turned to confront him, he threw me completely down. I wish I could describe to you his power. You would know if I were to attack you, to deal you a sharp blow with an arm you never saw move towards you. But something in me said, "Show him your own power." And I rose up fast, going right for him with both arms out. And I hit the empty night swirling beneath that lamppost, and stood there looking about me alone and a complete fool. This was a test of some sort. I knew it then, though consciously I fixed my attention of the dark street, the recesses of the doorways, any place he might have hidden. I wanted no part of this test, but saw no way out of it. And I was contemplating some way to disdainfully make that clear, when suddenly he appeared again, jerking me around and flinging me down the sloping cobblestones where I'd fallen before. I felt his boot against my ribs, and enraged, I grabbed hold of his leg, scarcely believing it when I felt the cloth and the bone. He'd fallen against the stone wall opposite and let out a snarl of unrepressed anger. What happened then was pure confusion. I held tight to that leg, though the boot strained to get at me, and at some point after he'd toppled over me and pulled loose from me, I was lifted into the air by strong hands. What might have happened, I can well imagine. He could have flung me several yards from himself. He was easily that strong, and battered, severely injured, I might have lost consciousness. It was violently disturbing to me, even in that melee, that I didn't know whether I could lose consciousness, but it was never put to a test. For, confused as I was certain someone else had come between us. Someone who was battling him decisively, forcing him to relinquish his hold. When I looked up, I was in the street, and I saw two figures only for an instant, like the flicker of an image after the eye is shut. Then there was only a swirling of black garments, a boot striking the stones, and the night was empty. I sat panting, the sweat pouring down my face, staring around me and then up at the narrow ribbon of faint sky, slowly, only because my eye was totally concentrated upon it now. A figure emerged from the darkness of the wall above me, crouched on the jutting stones of the lintel. It turned so that I saw the barest gleam of light on the hair, and then the stark white face. A strange face, broader and not so gaunt as the other, a large dark eye that was holding me steadily. A whisper came from the lips, though they never appeared to move. "You are all right." I was more than all right. I was on my feet, ready to attack. But the figure remained crouched, as if it were part of the wall. I could see a white hand working in what appeared to be a waistcoat pocket. A card appeared, white as the fingers that extended it to me. I didn't move to take it. "Come to us tomorrow night," said that same whisper from the smooth, expressionless face, which still showed only one eye to the light. "I won't harm you," he said, "and neither will that other. I won't allow it." And his hand did that thing which vampires can make happen. That is, it seemed to leave his body in the dark, to deposit the card in my hand, the purple script immediately shining in the light, and the figure moving upwards like a cat on the wall vanished fast between the garret gables overhead. I knew I was alone now, could feel it, and the pounding of my heart seemed to fill the empty little street as I stood under the lamp, reading that card. The address I knew well enough because I had been to theatres along that street more than once, but the name was astonishing. Théâtre des Vampires, and the time noted 9 p.m. I turned it over and discovered written there the note, "Bring the petite beauty with you. You are most welcome. Armand." There was no doubt that the figure who'd given it to me had written this message, and I had only a very short time to get to the hotel and to tell Claudia of these things before dawn. I was running fast, so that even the people I passed on the boulevards did not actually see the shadow that brushed them. The Théâtre des Vampires was by invitation only, and the next night the doorman inspected my card for a moment while the rain fell softly all around us. On the man and the woman stopped at the shut-up box office, on the crinkling posters of penny dreadful vampires with their outstretched arms and cloaks, resembling bat wings ready to close on the naked shoulders of a mortal victim, on the couple that pressed past us into the packed lobby where I could easily perceive that the crowd was all human. No vampires among them, not even this boy who admitted us finally into the press of conversation and damp wool and ladies' gloved fingers fumbling with felt-brimmed hats and wet curls. I pressed for the shadows in a feverish excitement. We had fed earlier only so that in the bustling street of this theatre our skin would not be too white, our eyes too unclouded, and that taste of blood which I had not enjoyed had left me all the more uneasy. But I had no time for it. This was no night for killing. This was to be a night of revelations. No matter how it ended, I was certain. Yet here we stood with this all-too-human crowd, the doors opening now on the auditorium, and a young boy pushing towards us, beckoning, pointing above the shoulders of the crowd to the stairs. Ours was a box, one of the best in the house, and if the blood had not dimmed my skin completely, nor made Claudia into a human child as she rode in my arms, this usher did not seem at all to notice it nor to care. In fact, he smiled all too readily as he drew back the curtain for us on 2 chairs before the brass rail. "Would you put it past them to have human slaves?" Claudia whispered. "But Lestat never trusted human slaves," I answered. I watched the seats fill, watched the marvelously flowered hats navigating below me through the rows of silk chairs. White shoulders gleamed in the deep curve of the balcony spreading out from us. Diamonds glittered in the gaslight. "Remember, be sly for once," came Claudia's whisper from beneath her bowed blonde head. "You're too much of a gentleman." The lights were going out. First in the balcony and then along the walls of the main floor, a knot of musicians had gathered in the pit below the stage, and at the foot of the long green velvet curtain the gas flickered, then brightened, and the audience receded as if it enveloped by a grey cloud through which only the diamonds sparkled on wrists, on throats, on fingers. And a hush descended like that grey cloud until all the sound was collected in one echoing persistent cough, then silence, and the slow rhythmical beating of a tambourine. Added to that was the thin melody of a wooden flute, which seemed to pick up the sharp metallic tink of the bells of the tambourine, winding them into a haunting melody that was medieval in sound. Then the strumming of strings that emphasized the tambourine, and the flute rose in that melody, singing of something melancholy, sad. It had a charm to it, this music, and the whole audience seemed stilled and united by it, as if the music of that flute were a luminous ribbon unfurling slowly in the dark. Not even the rising curtain broke the silence with the slightest sound. The lights brightened, and it seemed the stage was not the stage, but a thickly wooded place, the light glittering on the roughened tree trunks and the thick clusters of leaves beneath the arch of darkness above, and through the trees could be seen what appeared the low stone bank of a river, and above that, beyond that, the glittering waters of the river itself. This whole 3-dimensional world produced in painting upon a fine silk scrim that shivered only slightly in a faint draught. A sprinkling of applause greeted the illusion, gathering adherents from all parts of the auditorium until it reached its short crescendo and died away. A dark draped figure was moving on the stage from tree trunk to tree trunk, so fast that as he stepped into the lights, he seemed to appear magically in the center, one arm flashing out from his cloak to show a silver scythe, and the other to hold a mask on a slender stick before the invisible face, a mask which showed the gleaming countenance of death, a painted skull. There were gasps from the crowd. It was death standing before the audience, the scythe poised, death at the edge of a dark wood. And something in me was responding now as the audience responded, not in fear, but in some human way, to the magic of that fragile painted set, the mystery of the lighted world there, the world in which this figure moved in his billowing black cloak, back and forth before the audience with the grace of a great panther, drawing forth, as it were, those gasps, those sighs, those reverent murmurs. And now behind this figure, whose very gestures seemed to have a captivating power, like the rhythm of the music to which it moved, came other figures from the wings. First an old woman, very stooped and bent, her grey hair like moss, her arm hanging down with the weight of a great basket of flowers, her shuddling steps scraped on the stage, and her head bobbed with the rhythm of the music, and the darting steps of the Green Reaper. And then she started back as she laid eyes on him, and slowly setting down her basket, made her hands into the attitude of prayer. She was tired. Her head leaned now on her hands as if in sleep, and she reached out for him, supplicating. But as he came towards her, he bent to look directly into her face, which was all shadows to us beneath her hair, and started back then, waving his hand as if to freshen the air. Laughter erupted uncertainly from the audience. But as the old woman rose and took after death, the laughter took over. The music broke into a jig with their running as round and round the stage the old woman pursued death, until he finally flattened himself into the dark of a tree trunk, bowing his masked face under his wing like a bird. And the old woman, lost defeated, gathered up her basket as the music softened and slowed to her pace, and made her way off the stage. I did not like it. I did not like the laughter. I could see the other figures moving in now, the music orchestrating their gestures, cripples on crutches and beggars with rags, the color of ash, all reaching out for death who whirled, escaping this one with a sudden arching of the back, fleeing from that one with an effeminate gesture of disgust, waving them all away finally in a foppish display of weariness and boredom. It was then I realized that the languid white hand that made these comic arcs was not painted white. It was a vampire hand which wrung laughter from the crowd, a vampire hand lifted now to the grinning skull as the stage was finally clear, as if stifling a yawn, and then this vampire, still holding the mask before his face, adopted marvelously the attitude of resting his weight against a painted silken tree, as if he were falling gently to sleep. The music twittered like birds, rippled like the flowing of the water, and the spotlight which encircled him in a yellow pool grew dim, all but fading away as he slept. And another spot pierced the scrim, seeming to melt it altogether, to reveal a young woman standing alone far upstage. She was majestically tall and all but enshrined by a voluminous mane of golden blonde hair. I could feel the awe of the audience, as she seemed to flounder in the spotlight, the dark forest rising on the perimeter so that she seemed to be lost in the trees. And she was lost, and not a vampire. The soil on her mean blouse and skirt was not stage paint, and nothing had touched her perfect face, which gazed into the light now. As beautiful and finely chiseled as the face of a marble virgin, that hair, her haloed veil, she could not see in the light, though all could see her, and the moan which escaped her lips as she floundered seemed to echo over the thin romantic singing of the flute, which was a tribute to that beauty. The figure of death woke with a start in his pale spotlight, and turned to see her as the audience had seen her, and to throw up his free hand in tribute, in awe. The twitter of laughter died before it became real. She was too beautiful, her grey eyes too distressed, the performance too perfect, and then the skull mask was thrown suddenly into the wings, and Death showed a beaming white face to the audience, his hurried hands stroking his handsome black hair, straightening a waistcoat, brushing imaginary dust from his lapels. Death in love, and clapping rose for the luminous countenance, the gleaming cheekbones, the winking black eye, as if it were all masterful illusion, when in fact it was merely and certainly the face of a vampire, the vampire who had accosted me in the Latin Quarter, that leering, grinning vampire, harshly illuminated by the yellow spot. My hand reached for Claudia's in the dark and pressed it tightly, but she sat still, as if enwrapped. The forest of the stage, through which that helpless mortal girl stared blindly towards the laughter, divided in two phantom halves, moving away from the center, freeing the vampire to close in on her.